Maya Chen stood frozen in the marble lobby of First National Bank, staring at the balance on her phone screen. $0.18. The joint savings account she had shared with her sister for 3 years, the one containing her entire emergency fund of $12,000, had been completely drained just 2 days ago. What made it worse was discovering exactly where the money had gone through a series of luxury resort charges in Bali. What happened next would expose a web of deception that went far deeper than stolen money. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, Maya had always been the responsible one. At 29, she worked as a pediatric nurse at Oregon Health Sciences University, pulling long shifts and saving every extra dollar with methodical precision. Her younger sister Chloe, 26, had always been the dreamer, floating between art projects and temporary jobs, never quite finding her footing in what their parents diplomatically called the practical world. Their parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the early 90s, building a modest but successful accounting firm in the Pearl District. They had instilled in both daughters the importance of education and hard work, though their approaches to parenting had evolved significantly between their first and second child. Maya remembered strict curfews, mandatory study hours, and the constant pressure to excel academically. By the time Chloe came of age, their parents had relaxed considerably, allowing her more freedom to explore her artistic inclinations. The joint account had been Maya's idea 3 years earlier, when Chloe was going through another financial rough patch. Fresh out of art school with substantial student debt and no steady income, Chloe had been living paycheck to paycheck from her barista job at a downtown coffee shop. Maya had proposed the arrangement as a way to help her sister build financial stability while teaching her better money management skills. The plan was simple. Both sisters would contribute to the account, with Maya depositing the majority of her savings as the foundation. Chloe would add whatever she could manage, even if it was just $50 a month. The account was meant for emergencies only, with the understanding that any withdrawals required discussion between both sisters. Maya maintained the account statements and monitoring, while Chloe had equal access to the funds through her own debit card. For the first 2 years, the system worked reasonably well. Chloe made small but consistent contributions, and the few withdrawals she made were for genuine emergencies: a car repair here, a medical bill there. Maya watched the balance grow steadily as she channeled her savings discipline into building what she hoped would become a foundation for both their futures. Everything changed 6 months ago when Chloe met Derek Martinez at a gallery opening in the Arts District. Derek was a charming photographer who specialized in destination weddings, constantly traveling to exotic locations for work. He drove a leased BMW, wore expensive clothes, and had the kind of effortless confidence that drew people into his orbit. Within weeks, Chloe was completely infatuated. Maya had met Derek only twice, both times at family dinners, where he charmed their parents with stories of photographing celebrities and destination weddings in places like Santorini and Cabo. There was something about his smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the way he seemed to catalog the details of their family's financial status during conversations. When Maya mentioned her concerns to Chloe, her sister dismissed them as jealousy over her newfound happiness. The engagement happened with characteristic speed. Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, presenting Chloe with what appeared to be an expensive diamond ring. The proposal photos he posted on social media were undeniably stunning, shot during golden hour with the iconic haystack rock in the background. Chloe was radiant, and even Maya had to admit they looked perfect together. Planning the wedding became Chloe's full-time obsession. She quit her barista job to focus on what she called her career as Derek's business partner, helping coordinate his photography bookings and managing his social media presence. The arrangement meant Chloe was no longer contributing to their joint account, but Maya continued making deposits, understanding that her sister was investing time in building a business with her future husband. The wedding itself was a modest affair at their parents' house, with Derek insisting they save money for what he called the adventure of a lifetime, a 3-week honeymoon in Southeast Asia. He had connections with luxury resorts through his photography work, he explained, and could get them incredible deals on accommodations that would normally cost thousands per night. Maya remembered feeling uneasy during the wedding reception when Derek spent most of his time networking with their father's business associates rather than celebrating with his new wife. He collected business cards with the enthusiasm of someone working a sales conference, and his questions about various guests' professions felt more like reconnaissance than casual conversation. When Maya mentioned her concerns to Chloe, her sister dismissed them as jealousy over her newfound happiness. The engagement happened with characteristic speed. Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, presenting Chloe with what appeared to be an expensive diamond ring. The proposal photos he posted on social media were undeniably stunning, shot during golden hour with the iconic haystack rock in the background. Chloe was radiant, and even Maya had to admit they looked perfect together. Planning the wedding became Chloe's full-time obsession. She quit her barista job to focus on what she called her career as Derek's business partner, helping coordinate his photography bookings and managing his social media presence. The arrangement meant Chloe was no longer contributing to their joint account, but Maya continued making deposits, understanding that her sister was investing time in building a business with her future husband. The wedding itself was a modest affair at their parents' house, with Derek insisting they save money for what he called the adventure of a lifetime, a 3-week honeymoon in Southeast Asia. He had connections with luxury resorts through his photography work, he explained, and could get them incredible deals on accommodations that would normally cost thousands per night. Maya remembered feeling uneasy during the wedding reception when Derek spent most of his time networking with their father's business associates rather than celebrating with his new wife. He collected business cards with the enthusiasm of someone working a sales conference, and his questions about various guests' professions felt more like reconnaissance than casual conversation. When Maya mentioned her concerns to Chloe, her sister dismissed them as jealousy over her newfound happiness. The engagement happened with characteristic speed. Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, presenting Chloe with what appeared to be an expensive diamond ring. The proposal photos he posted on social media were undeniably stunning, shot during golden hour with the iconic haystack rock in the background. Chloe was radiant, and even Maya had to admit they looked perfect together. Planning the wedding became Chloe's full-time obsession. She quit her barista job to focus on what she called her career as Derek's business partner, helping coordinate his photography bookings and managing his social media presence. The arrangement meant Chloe was no longer contributing to their joint account, but Maya continued making deposits, understanding that her sister was investing time in building a business with her future husband. The wedding itself was a modest affair at their parents' house, with Derek insisting they save money for what he called the adventure of a lifetime, a 3-week honeymoon in Southeast Asia. He had connections with luxury resorts through his photography work, he explained, and could get them incredible deals on accommodations that would normally cost thousands per night. Maya remembered feeling uneasy during the wedding reception when Derek spent most of his time networking with their father's business associates rather than celebrating with his new wife. He collected business cards with the enthusiasm of someone working a sales conference, and his questions about various guests' professions felt more like reconnaissance than casual conversation. When Maya mentioned her concerns to Chloe, her sister dismissed them as jealousy over her newfound happiness. The engagement happened with characteristic speed. Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, presenting Chloe with what appeared to be an expensive diamond ring. The proposal photos he posted on social media were undeniably stunning, shot during golden hour with the iconic haystack rock in the background. Chloe was radiant, and even Maya had to admit they looked perfect together. Planning the wedding became Chloe's full-time obsession. She quit her barista job to focus on what she called her career as Derek's business partner, helping coordinate his photography bookings and managing his social media presence. The arrangement meant Chloe was no longer contributing to their joint account, but Maya continued making deposits, understanding that her sister was investing time in building a business with her future husband. The wedding itself was a modest affair at their parents' house, with Derek insisting they save money for what he called the adventure of a lifetime, a 3-week honeymoon in Southeast Asia. He had connections with luxury resorts through his photography work, he explained, and could get them incredible deals on accommodations that would normally cost thousands per night. Maya remembered feeling uneasy during the wedding reception when Derek spent most of his time networking with their father's business associates rather than celebrating with his new wife. He collected business cards with the enthusiasm of someone working a sales conference, and his questions about various guests' professions felt more like reconnaissance than casual conversation. When Maya mentioned her concerns to Chloe, her sister dismissed them as jealousy over her newfound happiness. The engagement happened with characteristic speed. Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, presenting Chloe with what appeared to be an expensive diamond ring. The proposal photos he posted on social media were undeniably stunning, shot during golden hour with the iconic haystack rock in the background. Chloe was radiant, and even Maya had to admit they looked perfect together. Planning the wedding became Chloe's full-time obsession. She quit her barista job to focus on what she called her career as Derek's business partner, helping coordinate his photography bookings and managing his social media presence. The arrangement meant Chloe was no longer contributing to their joint account, but Maya continued making deposits, understanding that her sister was investing time in building a business with her future husband. The wedding itself was a modest affair at their parents' house, with Derek insisting that
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
this was done by my sister. She's traveling internationally with her new husband, and apparently decided our emergency fund was available for their honeymoon expenses. Patricia winced sympathetically. That's a difficult situation. You might want to consider speaking with one of our financial advisors about preventing future withdrawals. We can convert the joint account to require both signatures for any transactions, or you could close it entirely and open individual accounts. Maya nodded, though the practical advice felt inadequate to address the emotional devastation of her sister's betrayal. She scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor for later that week and left the bank with copies of all the account statements, feeling emotionally drained but determined to take control of the situation. Back at her apartment, a tidy one-bedroom unit in the Hawthorne district, Maya spread the bank statements across her dining room table. She had moved here 2 years ago, specifically because the rent was affordable enough to allow substantial savings. The furniture was mostly secondhand, the decorations minimal, all in service of her goal to eventually buy a house where she could build a real life for herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Heard from Chloe today. She sounds like she's having the time of her life in Bali. Such a blessing that Derek could arrange such a wonderful trip. Hope you're doing well, honey." Maya stared at the message, wondering if Chloe had mentioned anything about the money to their parents. Probably not. Her sister had always been skilled at presenting her most glamorous moments while glossing over inconvenient details. The image their parents had of Chloe's honeymoon was likely very different from the financial reality Maya was now confronting. She drafted several response texts, but deleted each one. What could she say? That their golden child had stolen her life savings to fund a luxury vacation? That she was now starting over financially at 29 because she had been naive enough to trust her sister with unrestricted access to her money? Instead, Maya simply replied, "Glad she's enjoying herself. I'm fine, thanks, Mom." The next morning brought another call from an unknown international number. Maya almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Maya, it's me." Chloe's voice sounded different, strained and exhausted rather than defensive. "Where are you calling from?" Maya asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The resort business center. Derek doesn't know I'm calling. Maya, I need to explain about the money." "I'm listening." There was a long pause before Chloe continued. "It started small. Derek said we could afford some upgrades because of his photography connections, but when we got here, everything cost more than expected. The resort packages, the excursions, even the food. He kept saying we deserved this experience, that we'd never get another chance to stay somewhere so luxurious." Maya waited, letting her sister continue. "I used the account for a few $100s at first, thinking I could replace it when we got back. But then Derek saw how easily I could access money, and he started suggesting more expensive activities, private dinners on the beach, couple spa treatments, shopping trips to the local markets. Every time I hesitated, he would get upset and say I was being selfish, that I didn't want to enjoy our honeymoon." The story was emerging in pieces, and Maya could hear the shame in her sister's voice. "He doesn't know how much money was in the account," Chloe continued. "I never told him the exact amount. But Maya, I've spent it all. Every penny. And now he's talking about extending our trip another week, going to Thailand. I don't know how to tell him we can't afford it. Maya felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at the theft of her savings, but also recognition that her sister was in a manipulative relationship she might not fully understand. Chloe, do you realize what you've done? That was my entire emergency fund. Money I saved for 3 years to buy a house. I have 18 cents in my bank account right now. Silence on the other end, then the sound of crying. I know, and I hate myself for it. I keep thinking about how to fix this, how to make it right, but I'm trapped here. Derek handles all our travel documents, our tickets, everything. And he keeps talking about this being just the beginning of our lifestyle together, about how we're going to travel the world for his photography business. Maya heard something in her sister's voice that alarmed her. Fear. Chloe, are you safe? I mean, really safe? Another pause. I think so. It's just, he gets angry when things don't go his way, and he's been drinking more since we've been here. Last night, he threw a glass when the room service was late. It didn't hit me, but it scared me. The conversation was interrupted by background noise, voices approaching. I have to go. He's coming back from his photo shoot. Maya, I'm so sorry. I'll find a way to pay you back, I promise. The line went dead, leaving Maya staring at her phone in the sudden silence of her apartment. Over the next 2 days, Maya tried to process both the financial and emotional implications of her sister's call. The money was devastating to lose, but the revelation that Chloe might be in an abusive relationship added a layer of complexity she hadn't anticipated. She researched Derek online, finding his photography website and social media profiles. The images were undeniably professional, showcasing his work at destination weddings around the world. But as she dug deeper, Maya noticed inconsistencies in his story. Some of the wedding photos were dated from the same weekends in different locations, suggesting they might be stock images rather than his actual work. Her phone rang Wednesday evening while she was reviewing job listings, wondering if she needed to pick up additional shifts to rebuild her savings more quickly. Maya Chen? The voice was unfamiliar, professional. Yes? This is Detective Sarah Kim with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. I'm calling about a fraud investigation that may involve your sister, Chloe Martinez. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Maya's heart rate increased immediately. Is my sister okay? Is she hurt? As far as we know, your sister is physically safe. We're investigating a case involving fraudulent wedding photography services, and her husband, Derek Martinez, is a person of interest. We understand you may have had financial dealings with Mr. Martinez through your sister. Maya sank into her couch, trying to process this new information. I haven't had any direct financial dealings with Derek, but my sister has been using our joint bank account for their honeymoon expenses. We'd like to speak with you in person if possible. Mr. Martinez is suspected of operating a wedding photography scam that has defrauded multiple couples across the Pacific Northwest. Your sister may unknowingly be involved, or she may have information that could help our investigation. They scheduled a meeting for the next day at the downtown precinct. Maya spent a sleepless night wondering how much deeper this situation could get and what it might mean for Chloe's safety. Detective Kim turned out to be a thoughtful woman in her 40s with a direct manner that Maya appreciated. They met in a small conference room where Maya provided copies of all the bank statements and described the timeline of events. What we're seeing, Detective Kim explained, is a pattern where Mr. Martinez targets women from financially stable families, often with access to family money or joint accounts. He courts them quickly, proposes marriage, and then uses the honeymoon period to access and drain available funds. Maya felt sick. Are you saying my sister was specifically targeted? It's possible. We've identified 4 other similar cases in the past 2 years. Always young women from middle-class families, always whirlwind romances, always expensive honeymoons that exceed the couple's apparent means. Detective Kim showed Maya photos of other women, all bearing a superficial resemblance to Chloe. Young, artistic, from financially stable but not wealthy families. The good news is that we've been building a case against Mr. Martinez for months. The bad news is that your sister is currently out of the country with him, which complicates our ability to ensure her safety or recover your funds. Maya absorbed this information slowly. What happens next? We're working with international authorities to locate them in Bali. Once we make contact, we'll need to determine whether your sister is a victim or a willing participant. Given what you've told me about her phone call, I suspect she's been manipulated, but we'll need to investigate thoroughly. The detective handed Maya a business card. I need you to understand that this is now a criminal investigation. If your sister has been knowingly participating in fraudulent activities, she could face charges. But if she's been manipulated or coerced, we want to help her. Maya left the police station with her head spinning. The financial betrayal she had been struggling with was apparently part of a much larger criminal operation. Her sister wasn't just inconsiderate or selfish. She was potentially either a victim or an accessory to fraud. That evening, Maya called her parents to explain the situation. The conversation was as difficult as she had anticipated. I don't understand, her mother said after Maya finished explaining about the police investigation. Derek seemed like such a nice young man. Are you sure this isn't some kind of mistake? Maya's father was more direct. How much money did Chloe take from your account? All of it, Dad. $12,000. Silence on the other end of the line.
We'll pay you back, her father said finally. This shouldn't be your burden. That's not the point, Maya replied, though she was grateful for the offer. The point is that Chloe may be in danger, and we need to figure out how to help her. Her parents agreed to cooperate with the police investigation, though Maya could hear the strain in their voices. Their family had always prided itself on avoiding drama and maintaining respectability in their community. Having their daughter potentially involved in a criminal investigation was devastating. Maya spent the next week in a strange limbo, going to work and maintaining her normal routine while waiting for updates from Detective Kim. The police had located Chloe and Derek at their resort in Bali and were coordinating with Indonesian authorities to make contact. The call came on a Friday afternoon while Maya was finishing her shift at the hospital. "We've made contact with your sister," Detective Kim reported. "She's cooperating with our investigation and has provided information about Mr. Martinez's activities. The good news is that she appears to be primarily a victim rather than a willing participant." Maya felt relief flood through her. Is she safe? She's being held at the U.S. consulate in Denpasar while we sort out the legal issues. Mr. Martinez has been arrested by Indonesian police on charges related to visa fraud and financial crimes. Your sister should be able to return home within the next few days. The detective paused before continuing. There's something else you should know. Your sister wasn't the only person Mr. Martinez was manipulating. We found evidence that he was simultaneously courting 2 other women online, presumably setting up his next targets. Your sister discovered this when she accessed his laptop to book a tour. Maya closed her eyes, imagining how devastating that discovery must have been for Chloe. What happens now? Your sister will likely need to testify in any prosecution of Mr. Martinez. As for the money, we're working to trace and recover funds, but I want to manage your expectations. These cases rarely result in full financial recovery for victims. Maya thanked the detective and sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, processing the conversation. Her sister was safe, but the ordeal was far from over. The financial loss was still devastating, and the emotional trauma for everyone involved would take time to heal. 2 days later, Maya picked up Chloe at Portland International Airport. Her sister looked exhausted and older. The carefree confidence she had radiated just weeks earlier, completely gone. They rode home in relative silence, both uncertain how to begin addressing what had happened. It wasn't until they were sitting in Maya's apartment, sharing takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant, that Chloe began to talk. "I knew something was wrong before you called," she said quietly. "Derek kept pushing me to access more money, and when I started asking questions about his business, he would change the subject or get angry. Then I found out about the other women." Maya listened as her sister described discovering Derek's laptop full of romantic emails with multiple women, all in various stages of his standard courtship process. He had spreadsheets, Maya, actual spreadsheets tracking different women's family financial situations, their access to money, their emotional vulnerability. I was just data points in his system. The betrayal was multi-layered, not just the theft of money, but the complete fabrication of love, partnership, and future plans. "I'm so sorry about the money," Chloe continued. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, But I need you to know that I never intended for it to go so far. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt trapped. Maya reached across the table and took her sister's hand. I'm sorry too. Sorry that you went through that manipulation and abuse. Sorry that I wasn't there to help you see the warning signs. Over the following weeks, as the legal proceedings moved forward, Maya and Chloe began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. The financial loss was painful, but Maya realized that it had also revealed important truths about family, trust, and resilience. Their parents followed through on their promise to help Maya recover financially, though she insisted on treating it as a loan rather than a gift. More importantly, the crisis had forced their family to have honest conversations about money, expectations, and support that they had been avoiding for years. Chloe moved in temporarily with Maya while she rebuilt her life and processed the trauma of her relationship with Derek. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in manipulation and abuse recovery, and slowly began to understand how she had been targeted and controlled. The joint bank account was closed permanently, but Maya found herself less focused on the money she had lost and more grateful for the sister she had found. The woman who returned from Bali was different from the one who had left for her honeymoon. More grounded, more aware, and paradoxically, more trustworthy than she had been before the crisis, revealed her capacity for both mistakes and growth. 6 months later, Derek Martinez was extradited to the United States to face federal fraud charges. The investigation had uncovered a network of financial crimes affecting dozens of victims across multiple states. Maya and Chloe both testified during the proceedings, their shared experience of his manipulation helping prosecutors build a comprehensive case. Maya never recovered the full $12,000, but the partial restitution, combined with her parents' assistance, allowed her to eventually purchase the home she had been saving for. More valuable than the financial recovery was the knowledge that her family had survived a crisis that could have destroyed their relationships permanently. Standing in the backyard of her new house, watching Chloe help their father install a garden bed, Maya reflected on how the worst betrayal of her life had ultimately led to the strongest bonds she had ever experienced with her family. Sometimes, the most painful experiences carved out space for the most meaningful growth. The fraud alert that had started this entire ordeal had been more than a warning about missing money. It had been an alarm announcing that their family's patterns of communication, trust, and support needed fundamental change. The price had been higher than Maya ever wanted to pay, but the transformation had been worth more than money could measure. The criminal trial of Derek Martinez began 8 months after his arrest, drawing media attention from across the Pacific Northwest. Maya found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight as one of the primary witnesses in what prosecutors described as one of the most sophisticated romance fraud schemes they had ever encountered. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland buzzed with activity as victims, their families, and media representatives filled the gallery. Maya sat in the witness waiting area, reviewing her testimony notes while trying to ignore the cameras positioned outside the building. She had never imagined that her personal financial crisis would become part of such a public spectacle. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison had prepared Maya extensively for her testimony, explaining how her case represented a crucial link in the prosecution's broader narrative. Unlike some of Derek's other victims who had only lost money, Maya's situation demonstrated the deeper psychological manipulation tactics he employed, particularly his use of family dynamics and trusted relationships to access funds. Chloe sat across the room, equally nervous but more visibly shaken. Over the past months, she had undergone intensive therapy to process not just the betrayal and manipulation, but also the guilt of having been the instrument through which Derek accessed Maya's savings. The relationship between the sisters had slowly healed, but courtroom appearances forced them to relive the trauma repeatedly. When Maya was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with deliberate calm, aware that Derek was watching from the defendant's table. He looked different from the charming photographer who had captivated her sister. Prison had aged him, and without his expensive clothes and practiced smile, he appeared smaller, more ordinary. Maya recounted the timeline of events clearly and methodically, describing the joint account arrangement, the gradual depletion of funds, and her growing realization that something was seriously wrong.
She avoided looking directly at Derek during her testimony, focusing instead on the prosecutor's questions and the jury's attentive faces. The defense attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, attempted to portray Maya as a controlling sister who had manipulated Chloe into the joint account arrangement for her own purposes. She suggested that Maya's financial losses were the result of a legitimate family disagreement rather than criminal fraud. Maya had anticipated these attacks on her character and responded with measured precision. She explained her motivations for establishing the joint account, provided documentation of her consistent contributions and Chloe's agreed-upon participation, and calmly refuted suggestions that she had coerced her sister into any financial arrangements. The most difficult moment came when Linda Chen questioned Maya about her knowledge of Derek's background before the marriage. Miss Chen, isn't it true that you expressed reservations about Mr. Martinez to your sister before their marriage? Yes, I had some concerns. What specific concerns did you share with Miss Martinez about her future husband? Maya chose her words carefully. I felt that he seemed very interested in our family's financial situation during conversations. He asked detailed questions about our parents' business and made comments about expensive purchases that seemed inconsistent with his claimed income level. But you never investigated these concerns further? You never hired a private investigator or conducted background checks? Maya felt the implicit criticism in the question. No, I didn't. I trusted my sister's judgment about her personal relationships, even when I had reservations. So you allowed your sister access to $12,000 of your money while having suspicions about her husband's character? The question was designed to make Maya appear either negligent or vindictive, depending on how she answered. She took a breath before responding. I maintained a joint account with my sister based on 3 years of successful financial cooperation. My reservations about Derek were personal impressions, not evidence of criminal activity. I never imagined that anyone would systematically target my sister as part of a fraud scheme. The prosecutor's redirect examination allowed Maya to clarify the distinction between personal concerns and actual knowledge of criminal behavior. She explained how Derek's manipulation tactics were specifically designed to isolate victims from family members who might raise questions about his activities. When Maya's testimony concluded, she felt drained but relieved to have presented her story clearly and honestly. The hardest part was yet to come, as Chloe would testify the following day about her experiences as Derek's primary victim. That evening, Maya and Chloe met for dinner at a quiet restaurant in the Alberta district, away from the media attention surrounding the courthouse. Both sisters looked exhausted from the day's proceedings, but there was also a sense of progress, of finally having their story heard and validated by an official process. How do you think it went? Chloe asked as they waited for their food to arrive. Maya considered the question. I think the jury understood what happened. The defense tried to make it seem like we were careless or greedy, but the evidence speaks for itself. Chloe nodded, picking nervously at her napkin. I keep thinking about all the things I should have noticed, the inconsistencies in his stories, the way he always deflected questions about his past. I feel like such an idiot for not seeing through him. Maya reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand. You weren't an idiot. You were targeted by someone who specializes in manipulation. That's not the same as being naive or stupid. The conversation was interrupted by Maya's phone buzzing with a text from Detective Kim. Jury selection complete for tomorrow. Your sister's testimony should begin around 10 a.m. Media presence expected to be heavy. Maya showed Chloe the message, and both sisters sighed simultaneously. The publicity surrounding the case had been both validating and invasive. While it felt important to have their story recognized as part of a larger pattern of victimization, the constant media attention made it difficult to process their experiences privately. The next morning, Chloe's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She described meeting Derek at the gallery opening, the whirlwind courtship that followed, and the gradual escalation of his financial demands during their honeymoon. Unlike Maya's methodical recounting of facts, Chloe's testimony was raw and emotional, providing the jury with insight into the psychological tactics Derek had employed to maintain control over his victims. She described how he would alternate between lavish romantic gestures and subtle criticism, creating a cycle of emotional dependency that made it difficult for her to trust her own judgment. The prosecutor asked Chloe to describe the moment she discovered Derek's communications with other women on his laptop. I was trying to book a snorkeling tour as a surprise for our anniversary, Chloe said, her voice barely audible. When I opened his email, I saw dozens of messages with other women, not just casual conversations, but intimate, romantic exchanges identical to things he had said to me.
She described finding the spreadsheets that cataloged his various targets, including detailed notes about their financial resources and emotional vulnerabilities. There were photographs of me in there, along with personal information about our family, our parents' business, Maya's job. It was like I wasn't a person to him, just data points in some kind of business plan. The courtroom was completely silent as Chloe described confronting Derek about the evidence she had found. At first, he denied everything, said the emails were old, from before we met. Then he got angry and started blaming me for being suspicious and paranoid. He said if I really loved him, I would trust him instead of snooping through his private communications. The defense cross-examination was brutal. Victoria Chen attacked Chloe's credibility relentlessly, suggesting that she had been a willing participant in Derek's schemes and was now claiming victimhood to avoid prosecution herself. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that you continued using your sister's money even after you became suspicious of your husband's activities? Chloe struggled to answer. I was confused and scared. Derek kept telling me that everything was normal, that I was overreacting. I didn't know who to believe. But you knew the money wasn't yours to spend freely, correct? You understood that your sister expected any large withdrawals to be discussed beforehand. Yes, but Derek said we were family now, that Maya would understand when we explained later. He kept saying we would pay her back as soon as his photography business picked up. How many times did you attempt to contact your sister to discuss these expenditures while you were in Bali? Chloe's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Not until Maya called me about the account balance. The admission was damaging, and Maya could see the jury's expressions shifting as they processed this information. Victoria Chen pressed her advantage, painting Chloe as an equal participant in the deception who was only claiming victimhood after being caught. The redirect examination allowed the prosecutor to contextualize Chloe's behavior within the framework of psychological manipulation and abuse. Expert witnesses testified about the common patterns in romance fraud cases, explaining how victims often participated in activities they would normally recognize as wrong because their judgment had been systematically compromised. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychologist specializing in fraud victims, explained to the jury how Derek's behavior fit established patterns of psychological coercion. Romance fraudsters like Mr. Martinez employ sophisticated manipulation techniques designed to isolate victims from their support networks and compromise their decision-making abilities, Dr. Walsh testified. The victims often participate in financial activities they would normally question because their emotional and psychological boundaries have been systematically eroded. She described the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and intermittent reinforcement that characterized Derek's relationships with his victims. The goal is to create emotional dependency and confusion, making it difficult for victims to trust their own perceptions of reality. The prosecution also presented evidence from Derek's other victims, women from Seattle, Eugene, and Bend, who had all experienced remarkably similar patterns of courtship and manipulation. The consistency of his methods across multiple relationships demonstrated the calculated nature of his criminal activity. Jennifer Santos, a marketing executive from Seattle, testified that Derek had drained her savings account of $15,000 during a supposed business trip to photograph a wedding in Costa Rica. Like Chloe, she had discovered evidence of his simultaneous relationships with multiple women only after significant financial and emotional damage had been done. He made me feel like I was the most important person in the world, Jennifer testified. Every conversation was about our future together, our shared dreams, the amazing life we were going to build. When he asked for access to money, it felt like a natural part of building that future together. The pattern was consistent across all victims. rapid courtship, elaborate future planning, gradual financial requests that escalated during trips or supposed emergencies, and systematic isolation from family and friends who might raise concerns. By the end of the prosecution's case, a clear picture had emerged of Derek Martinez as a calculating predator who had refined his techniques across multiple victims over several years. The defense's attempts to portray the victims as willing participants or unreliable witnesses were undermined by the overwhelming consistency of evidence. Derek's decision not to testify on his own behalf surprised no one. His defense relied primarily on challenging the credibility of individual victims and suggesting that the relationships, while perhaps unethical, did not rise to the level of criminal fraud. During closing arguments, Assistant District Attorney Morrison summarized the case methodically, walking the jury through the evidence of systematic deception and financial manipulation. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about romantic relationships gone wrong. This is about a calculated criminal enterprise designed to identify, target, and exploit vulnerable women for financial gain. The defendant didn't fall in love with these women. He studied them, manipulated them, and discarded them once their financial resources were exhausted. Morrison displayed charts showing the financial timeline across all of Derek's relationships, demonstrating the methodical way he had extracted money from each victim before moving on to the next target. The defense wants you to believe that these women were willing participants in their own victimization, but the evidence shows a consistent pattern of psychological manipulation designed specifically to overcome normal decision-making processes. This wasn't love. It was fraud, plain and simple. Victoria Chen's closing argument focused on the complexity of the relationships and the difficulty of distinguishing between poor relationship choices and criminal behavior. My client may not have been the ideal husband or business partner, but making bad decisions in relationships is not a federal crime, she argued. Each of these women had access to the same information available to anyone conducting basic research about a potential partner. They chose to trust someone who ultimately disappointed them, but that doesn't make him a criminal. She challenged the jury to consider whether the government had proven criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt, suggesting that Derek's behavior could be explained by immaturity and poor judgment rather than calculated fraud. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Derek showed no visible emotion as the verdicts were read, but Maya noticed his hands trembling slightly as he was led away in handcuffs. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, providing victims with an opportunity to address the court about the impact of Derek's crimes. Maya had debated whether to speak, ultimately deciding that her voice needed to be heard as part of the public record. Your Honor, Derek Martinez didn't just steal money from our family. He stole our trust, our sense of security, and our faith in our ability to protect the people we love, Maya told the court. The financial loss was devastating, but the psychological impact has been even more profound. She described the months of therapy, the ongoing challenges in rebuilding trust within her family, and the way the experience had fundamentally changed how she approached relationships and financial decisions. I want the court to understand that the victims of romance fraud don't just lose money. We lose our belief in our own judgment, our willingness to trust others, and our sense of safety in the world. These are injuries that heal slowly, if they heal at all. Chloe's victim impact statement was more personal, describing the ongoing trauma of realizing that her marriage, her supposed love story, had been an elaborate performance designed to exploit her and her family. I keep waiting to wake up from this nightmare, to discover that some part of my relationship with Derek was real, she told the court. But the evidence has made it clear that every moment, every conversation, every promise was calculated to serve subliminal purposes.
He didn't just steal money. He stole a year of my life and made me an unwitting accomplice in hurting the people I love most. Judge Margaret Torres sentenced Derek to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution to all identified victims. While the financial restitution was substantial, both Maya and Chloe understood that actually recovering the money would be a lengthy and uncertain process.
After the sentencing, Maya and Chloe walked out of the courthouse together, finally able to speak freely about their experiences without concern for how their words might impact the legal proceedings. "How do you feel?" Maya asked as they stood on the courthouse steps, watching reporters pack up their equipment. Chloe considered the question carefully. "Relieved, I think. Not healed, but relieved that it's officially over, that someone in authority has acknowledged what really happened to us." Maya nodded, understanding the distinction. The legal resolution provided validation and closure, but the personal healing process would continue long after Derek Martinez disappeared into the federal prison system. Over the following months, Maya and Chloe began the process of rebuilding not just their financial security, but their relationship with each other and their understanding of trust, vulnerability, and family bonds. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also revealed strengths and resilience neither sister had known she possessed. Maya returned to work at the hospital with a new appreciation for the importance of her financial independence and professional identity. She had learned to trust her instincts about people and situations while also recognizing the difference between healthy skepticism and paralyzing fear. Chloe enrolled in a graduate program in social work, motivated by her experience as a fraud victim to help others navigate similar crises. She moved into her own apartment, establishing independence while maintaining the closer relationship with Maya that had emerged from their shared ordeal. The restitution payments from Derek's assets provided partial financial recovery, though neither sister ever recovered the full amount of their losses. More importantly, the experience had taught them lessons about resilience, family loyalty, and the difference between material security and genuine safety that no amount of money could have purchased. Maya kept copies of all the court documents in a file folder in her home office, not as monuments to victimization, but as reminders of their family's capacity to survive betrayal and emerge stronger. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came wrapped in the most painful experiences, and sometimes justice arrived slowly but definitively through the patient work of building a case, telling the truth, and trusting the system to recognize and punish predatory behavior. The fraud alert that had started their nightmare had ultimately led to Derek Martinez's conviction and imprisonment, preventing him from targeting additional victims. In the end, Maya realized that being victimized was not the same as being powerless, and that surviving systematic manipulation was its own form of strength and victory. 2 years after Derek Martinez's sentencing, Maya stood in the kitchen of her new home in the Lawhurst neighborhood, preparing dinner for what had become a monthly tradition. The house was everything she had dreamed of when she first started saving: hardwood floors, updated appliances, a small garden where she grew herbs and vegetables, and most importantly, a sense of security that came from owning something entirely through her own efforts. The doorbell rang precisely at 6 o'clock, announcing the arrival of Chloe and their parents. These family dinners had evolved naturally from the forced gatherings of their childhood into genuine celebrations of their continued connection. The dynamics had shifted permanently after the trial, with everyone more conscious of communication patterns and more intentional about creating space for honest conversation. Chloe entered carrying a bouquet of flowers from the farmer's market and a bottle of wine from a local vineyard. At 28, she carried herself with a confidence that had been absent during her relationship with Derek. Her work as a victim advocate at the County Social Services Department had given her purpose and professional identity that complemented rather than competed with her artistic pursuits. David and Linda Chen arrived bearing their usual contributions: homemade dumplings and updates from their accounting firm. The business had grown significantly in recent years, partly due to their involvement in fraud prevention consulting that had emerged from their experience with Derek's case. They had become unlikely experts in financial manipulation tactics, helping other families recognize and avoid similar scams. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily between work updates, neighborhood news, and plans for the upcoming holidays. The easy rhythm of their interaction would have been impossible to imagine during the crisis period, but trauma had a way of either destroying families or forging them into something stronger than before. "I got the final restitution payment yesterday," Maya mentioned as she served dessert. "It wasn't much, but it officially closes that chapter." Derek's assets had been liquidated over the past 2 years, providing partial compensation to his victims.
Maya had ultimately recovered about 40% of her stolen savings, while other victims received varying amounts depending on when they had been targeted and how much evidence supported their claims. Any regrets about not pursuing civil litigation? David asked. He had initially advocated for aggressive legal action to recover the full amount, but Maya had chosen to focus on moving forward rather than extending the legal battle indefinitely. Maya considered the question, as she had many times before. No regrets. The criminal case served justice, and I've rebuilt my savings to where they were before. Spending more time and energy fighting over money that probably doesn't exist anyway would have kept me stuck in victim mode. Chloe nodded approvingly. I think you made the right choice. I've seen too many fraud victims at work who spend years fighting legal battles that consume more resources than they could ever recover. The conversation shifted to Chloe's work, which had become a source of family pride. Her first-hand experience with manipulation and fraud had made her uniquely effective at helping other victims navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of recovery. We had a case last week that reminded me so much of what we went through, Chloe said. A woman whose boyfriend had been systematically draining her business account for online gambling. She kept blaming herself for not seeing the signs earlier. Linda shook her head sympathetically. It's heartbreaking how people blame themselves for being deceived by experts in deception. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. 2 years earlier, Linda had struggled to understand how Chloe could have been so thoroughly manipulated by Derek. Her work with fraud prevention clients had educated her about the sophisticated psychology behind these crimes. After their parents left, Maya and Chloe settled into the living room with tea, extending their evening together as had become their custom. These private conversations after family dinners often produced the most meaningful exchanges, creating space for topics that didn't belong in the larger group dynamic. I've been thinking about dating again, Chloe said, apparently casual but with an undercurrent of anxiety that Maya immediately recognized. Maya set down her teacup and gave her sister full attention. This was the first time Chloe had mentioned romantic interest since Derek's conviction. How do you feel about that? Maya asked, keeping her tone neutral and supportive. Chloe smiled wryly. Terrified, mostly, but also lonely, and tired of letting Derek's manipulation control my life indefinitely. She described meeting someone at a conference for victim advocates, a social worker named Marcus who specialized in domestic violence counseling. Their initial connection had been purely professional, but had gradually evolved into friendship and mutual attraction.
What scares you most about it? Maya asked. Everything, Chloe laughed. Trusting my judgment again, introducing someone new to the family, explaining my history. But mostly, I'm scared of falling back into patterns where I lose myself trying to please someone else. Maya understood the fear intimately. Her own approach to relationships had become more cautious since the Derek experience, though she had managed one brief relationship that ended amicably when both parties realized they were more interested in companionship than romance. Have you talked to Dr. Peterson about this? Maya asked, referring to Chloe's therapist. Extensively. She thinks I'm ready, but she also understands why I'm hesitant. She's been helping me identify what healthy boundaries look like in practice, not just in theory. They discussed strategies for maintaining independence while allowing emotional intimacy, recognizing red flags without becoming paranoid, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than rescue dynamics. The weird thing is, Chloe continued, my experience with Derek has actually made me better at my job. I can spot manipulation tactics immediately now, and I have credibility with clients because I've been where they are. Maya nodded. Sometimes our worst experiences become our greatest strengths, though I wouldn't wish the learning process on anyone. The conversation continued past midnight, covering territory they had traversed many times, but from slightly different angles each time. Healing wasn't linear, and each stage of recovery brought new challenges and insights. The following week brought news that would test the family's resilience in an unexpected way. Derek Martinez had been granted early parole due to prison overcrowding and good behavior, reducing his sentence from 12 years to 6. The notification came through the Victim Services Coordinator, delivered with apologies and explanations about the realities of the federal prison system. Maya's first reaction was anger, not at Derek's release, but at the failure of the system to provide adequate notice to victims. Learning about his parole status through an automated phone message felt like a final insult after years of trauma and recovery. Chloe's reaction was more complex, mixing fear with a strange sense of indifference that surprised her. "I thought I would be more upset," she told Maya over lunch the day after they received the notification. "But honestly, I feel like he's already irrelevant to my life." The family met with Detective Kim, now promoted to sergeant, to discuss safety protocols and legal restrictions associated with Derek's parole. He was prohibited from contacting any of his victims directly or indirectly, required to remain in California where his sister lived, and subject to regular monitoring by parole officers. Realistically, the chances of him violating parole by traveling to Oregon or attempting to contact any of you are minimal, Sergeant Kim explained. He knows he's being watched, and any violation would send him back to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence. Despite these assurances, Maya found herself hypervigilant for several weeks after learning of Derek's release. She varied her routes to work, paid closer attention to her surroundings, and experienced a low-level anxiety that reminded her of the months immediately following the original crime. Chloe seemed less affected, continuing her normal routine while taking reasonable precautions. Her work with other victims had given her perspective on the statistical likelihood of re-victimization by the same perpetrator. "Most romance fraudsters move on to new hunting grounds," she explained to Maya. "Derek knows we're educated about his tactics now, and he knows law enforcement is watching him. We represent too much risk and not enough potential reward." 3 months after Derek's release, Maya received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer Santos, the Seattle victim who had testified during the trial. Jennifer had started a support group for romance fraud survivors and was organizing a conference for victims and their families. "I know it might sound strange, but some of us have found it helpful to turn our experiences into advocacy and education," Jennifer explained. "We're calling it Surviving and Thriving After Romance Fraud, and we'd love to have you and Chloe participate if you're interested." Maya was initially hesitant, having worked hard to move beyond her identity as a fraud victim. But Jennifer's description of the conference emphasized empowerment and prevention rather than dwelling on victimization. "We're not looking for people to share their trauma stories," Jennifer clarified. "We want to focus on practical strategies for recovery, warning signs to share with others, and policy changes that could prevent these crimes." After discussing it with Chloe, both sisters agreed to participate. Maya would speak about financial recovery and rebuilding trust in family relationships, while Chloe would address career transitions and finding purpose through victim advocacy work. The conference took place at a hotel near Seattle's waterfront, drawing nearly 200 attendees, including fraud victims, their families, law enforcement professionals, and financial industry representatives. The diversity of participants reflected the widespread nature of romance fraud and the complex support networks required for effective prevention and recovery. Maya's presentation focused on practical strategies for financial recovery after fraud, emphasizing the importance of rebuilding savings gradually while addressing the emotional relationship with money that fraud often damages. One of the most overlooked aspects of financial fraud recovery is the psychological impact on how we think about money and security, she told the audience. Many victims become either obsessively controlling about finances or completely avoidant of financial planning. Neither extreme serves long-term recovery. She described her own journey from devastation to stability, sharing specific techniques for rebuilding savings while maintaining a healthy relationship with financial risk and trust. Chloe's presentation was more emotional, addressing the process of rebuilding identity and self-trust after manipulation. She spoke candidly about the shame and self-blame that characterized her early recovery and the professional therapy and support that had been essential for healing. "Recovery from romance fraud isn't just about getting your money back," she told the audience. "It's about reclaiming your ability to trust your own judgment, to form healthy relationships, and to believe that you deserve love and respect." The audience response was overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees approaching both sisters after their presentations to share their own stories and express gratitude for the practical advice and hope the presentations had provided. During the lunch break, Maya found herself in conversation with Dr. Michael Torres, a researcher from the University of Washington who was studying the long-term psychological impacts of financial fraud. Your family's experience is particularly interesting because you had strong support systems and were able to maintain family relationships throughout the crisis, Dr. Torres explained. Many fraud victims experience secondary victimization from family members who blame them for the crime. Maya reflected on how different their experience might have been without their parents' support and understanding, or if she and Chloe had allowed the crime to permanently damage their relationship. I think the key was recognizing that Chloe was a victim too, even though she was the one who directly accessed my money. It would have been easy to blame her instead of focusing on the real perpetrator. Dr. Torres nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly the kind of insight that could help other families navigate similar crises. Have you considered writing about your experience? The suggestion planted a seed that would grow over the following months. Maya had never considered herself a writer, but she began documenting their family's experience with the thought that other fraud victims might benefit from reading about successful recovery strategies. Back in Portland, Maya began working on what would eventually become a resource guide for romance fraud victims and their families. The project consumed her evenings and weekends, but provided a sense of purpose and closure that she hadn't anticipated. Chloe contributed sections about recognizing manipulation tactics and rebuilding self-esteem after victimization. Their parents provided insights about supporting family members through fraud recovery while maintaining healthy boundaries and expectations. The writing process forced all of them to examine their experience from new angles, identifying lessons learned and strategies that had been effective in their particular circumstances. It also created opportunities for conversations they might not have had otherwise, deepening their understanding of how each family member had been affected by the crime. 6 months after the Seattle conference, Maya received a call from a publisher who had heard about their resource guide through victim advocacy networks. True Recovery Press specialized in self-help and recovery resources, and they were interested in publishing a bigger version of Maya's work as a comprehensive guide for fraud victims. The publishing process took nearly a year, during which Maya balanced her nursing career with extensive interviews, research, and revision. The final product, titled Beyond the Scam, A Family's Guide to Healing After Romance Fraud, became a well-regarded resource in victim services networks across the country. More importantly for Maya, completing the book provided a sense of completion and purpose that transformed her relationship with the original trauma. Instead of being something that had happened to her family, the fraud became something they had survived and learned from in ways that could help others. The book launch took place at Powell's Books in downtown Portland, with family, friends, colleagues, and members of the victim advocacy community in attendance. Maya read selections from chapters about financial recovery and family healing, while Chloe discussed her work with other fraud victims. Standing behind the podium, looking out at an audience of supporters and strangers who had come to learn from their experience, Maya reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had been devastated by financial loss and family betrayal. Tonight, she was celebrating the publication of work that could prevent others from experiencing similar trauma. After the formal presentation, Maya and Chloe signed books and answered questions from audience members. Many were fraud victims themselves, others were family members seeking guidance, and some were professionals working in victim services or fraud prevention. An elderly woman approached Maya near the end of the evening, carrying a well-worn copy of the book that she had obviously read thoroughly. "I wanted to thank you for writing this," the woman said. "My daughter was victimized by someone very similar to Derek Martinez last year. Reading your book helped our whole family understand what had happened and how to support her recovery," she continued. "But more than that, it helped us understand that families can survive these kinds of crises and emerge stronger if they handle them properly. Your story gave us hope when we needed it most." Maya felt tears forming as she listened to the woman's gratitude. This was exactly why the difficult process of writing and publishing had been worthwhile. As the evening wound down, Maya and Chloe walked to their cars together, both exhausted but satisfied with the event's success. "Remember when you thought your life was over because of the missing money?" Chloe asked as they reached Maya's car.
Maya laughed. That seems like a different lifetime, although I do still think $12,000 is a lot of money. It is, Chloe agreed, but look what we built from losing it. Maya considered the observation. The financial loss had been painful and the recovery process difficult, but the experience had ultimately strengthened their family relationships, launched Chloe's career in victim advocacy, contributed to fraud prevention efforts in their community, and now produced a resource that could help others navigate similar crises. The fraud alert that had started their nightmare had also started a journey toward resilience, purpose, and connection that none of them could have imagined when they were living through the crisis. 6 months later, Maya received a letter forwarded through her publisher from a woman in Phoenix whose family had used their book to navigate recovery from a similar fraud. The woman wrote that Maya's emphasis on maintaining family relationships while setting appropriate boundaries had been crucial for her family's healing process. "Your book didn't just help us understand what had happened," the woman wrote. "It showed us what recovery could look like if we did the work properly. Thank you for sharing your story and making our path easier." Maya added the letter to a file she kept of correspondence from readers, a growing collection of evidence that their painful experience had been transformed into something genuinely helpful for others. Standing in her kitchen that evening, preparing dinner in the home she had been able to purchase despite the financial setback, Maya reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken since that day she discovered the empty bank account. The fraud had cost her money, but it had given her family deeper relationships, professional purpose, and a story worth sharing. Sometimes the worst betrayals created space for the most meaningful growth, and sometimes the most painful experiences contained the seeds of the greatest contributions one could make to the world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Chloe announcing her engagement to Marcus, the social worker she had been dating for over a year. The news brought a smile to Maya's face as she thought about how different this relationship was from Chloe's experience with Derek, built on mutual respect, shared values, and careful attention to healthy boundaries. The wedding planning would be different this time too, with family involvement, transparent financial discussions, and the kind of joy that came from genuine partnership rather than manipulation and deception. Maya saved Chloe's text and returned to preparing dinner, grateful for the ordinary evening routine that represented the security and stability she had rebuilt from the ashes of her worst financial crisis. Sometimes the best revenge was living well, and sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal was building something better from whatever remained. Romance fraud represents one of the fastest categories of financial crime, with victims losing billions of dollars annually to sophisticated scammers who exploit human emotions for monetary gain. Unlike traditional financial crimes that rely on technical deception or identity theft, romance fraud operates through psychological manipulation, making it particularly devastating for victims who suffer both financial and emotional trauma. The Federal Trade Commission reports that romance scams resulted in losses exceeding $547 million in 2021 alone, with individual victims losing an average of $2,400. However, these figures likely represent only a fraction of actual losses, as many victims never report these crimes due to shame, embarrassment, or failure to recognize they have been victimized. The true scope of romance fraud extends far beyond financial statistics, encompassing profound psychological damage that can persist long after the monetary losses have been addressed. Romance fraud operates on a foundation of carefully constructed deception designed to bypass rational decision-making processes. Perpetrators, often working as part of organized criminal networks, study their targets extensively before making contact. They analyze social media profiles, public records, and online activity to identify vulnerabilities and craft personalized approaches that maximize their chances of success. The typical romance fraud follows a predictable pattern that unfolds over weeks or months. Initial contact appears coincidental, often through social media platforms, dating websites, or professional networking sites. The scammer presents an attractive persona, usually featuring professional photos stolen from legitimate social media accounts, and a compelling personal story designed to elicit sympathy and interest. During the courtship phase, scammers invest considerable time and effort in building emotional connections with their targets. They engage in lengthy phone conversations, exchange hundreds of text messages, and create elaborate future plans together.
This intensive communication serves multiple purposes. It establishes emotional dependency, isolates victims from their support networks, and provides opportunities to gather information about the victim's financial resources and personal vulnerabilities. The grooming process typically includes several key elements that distinguish romance fraud from legitimate relationships. Scammers often claim to be traveling for work, deployed overseas with the military, or living in foreign countries for business purposes. These scenarios provide convenient explanations for why they can't meet in person while creating urgency around their supposed need for financial assistance. Love bombing, a manipulation technique characterized by excessive attention and affection, plays a central role in romance fraud schemes. Victims report being overwhelmed by constant communication, lavish compliments, and grandiose declarations of love that seem disproportionate to the length of the relationship. This intensive emotional investment creates psychological bonds that make it difficult for victims to recognize inconsistencies in the scammer's story or respond rationally to requests for money. The financial exploitation phase typically begins with small requests framed as temporary emergencies.
Common scenarios include medical expenses, travel costs to visit the victim, customs fees for packages, or business emergencies requiring immediate funding. These initial requests serve as tests to gauge the victim's willingness to provide financial assistance and establish precedent for larger requests. Successful initial requests are followed by escalating demands for money, often accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations for why funds are needed. Scammers may claim to have been robbed, hospitalized, detained by authorities, or faced with unexpected business crises. Each emergency is presented as the final obstacle preventing them from being together, encouraging victims to view their financial assistance as an investment in their shared future. The psychology behind romance fraud vulnerability involves several factors that transcend age, education, and socioeconomic status. Loneliness represents the primary risk factor, with scammers specifically targeting individuals who appear isolated or seeking companionship. Recent life transitions such as divorce, death of a spouse, job loss, or retirement can create emotional vulnerabilities that scammers exploit. Social media and dating platforms provide scammers with unprecedented access to potential victims and detailed information about their personal lives, financial status, and emotional needs. The anonymity and distance inherent in online communication make it easier for scammers to maintain false identities, while making it harder for victims to verify information or seek input from friends and family. Cognitive biases also contribute to romance fraud susceptibility. The sunk cost fallacy causes victims to continue investing money in relationships where they have already suffered losses, reasoning that abandoning the relationship would waste their previous investments. Confirmation bias leads victims to focus on information that supports their belief in the relationship while dismissing evidence that contradicts it. The shame and embarrassment associated with being deceived often prevent victims from seeking help or advice from friends and family. Scammers actively exploit this tendency by framing their requests for secrecy around romantic intimacy rather than criminal activity. They often discourage victims from discussing their relationship with others, claiming that family and friends wouldn't understand their unique connection. Warning signs of romance fraud include several red flags that potential victims and their support networks should recognize. Individuals who refuse to meet in person, speak by phone, or video chat despite months of online communication should raise immediate suspicion. Requests for money, regardless of the stated reason, represent clear warning signs, particularly when accompanied by urgency or emotional manipulation. Inconsistencies in personal stories, such as changing details about background, profession, or location, indicate possible deception. Poor grammar or language patterns inconsistent with claimed nationality or education level may suggest the use of translation software or non-native speakers working from scripts. Professional photos that appear too polished or model-like warrant verification through reverse image searches. Legitimate individuals typically have varied, candid photos showing them in different settings and contexts. Scammers often use stolen photos from social media accounts or professional portfolios, which can be identified through image recognition technology. Claims of wealth, high-status employment, or exotic travel should be viewed skeptically when accompanied with requests for financial assistance. The contrast between claimed affluence and financial need represents a fundamental inconsistency that should prompt further investigation. Prevention strategies for romance fraud require both individual awareness and systematic changes in how online platforms address these crimes. Personal prevention begins with maintaining healthy skepticism about online relationships, particularly those that progress unusually quickly or involve intense emotional declarations early in the interaction. Verification represents a crucial component of fraud prevention. Individuals should insist on video calls or in-person meetings before developing serious emotional investments in online relationships. Reverse image searches can quickly identify stolen photos, while basic internet searches may reveal inconsistencies in claimed backgrounds or professions. Financial boundaries provide essential protection against romance fraud. Establishing firm policies against sending money to online romantic interests, regardless of circumstances, eliminates the primary mechanism through which these crimes occur. Victims who maintain these boundaries consistently report avoiding significant financial losses even when targeted by skilled scammers. Communication with trusted friends and family about online relationships can provide external perspectives that help identify potential fraud. Scammers often work to isolate victims from their support networks, so maintaining these connections and seeking input about new relationships can serve as an important safeguard. Platform-level prevention requires dating websites and social media companies to implement stronger verification processes, improve fraud detection algorithms, and provide better education about romance fraud risks. Some platforms have begun requiring identity verification, implementing artificial intelligence to detect suspicious communication patterns, and creating reporting mechanisms that allow users to flag potential scammers. Recovery from romance fraud involves addressing both financial and emotional trauma through a comprehensive approach that recognizes the complex nature of these crimes. Financial recovery may include working with law enforcement to trace stolen funds, pursuing civil litigation against perpetrators when possible, and implementing strategies to rebuild saving and credit. However, the emotional recovery process often proves more challenging and longer-lasting than financial remediation. Victims frequently experience shame, self-blame, and damaged trust that affects their ability to form future relationships or make important decisions. Professional counseling, particularly with therapists experienced in fraud trauma, can provide essential support during the recovery process. Support groups for romance fraud victims offer opportunities to connect with others who have experienced similar trauma, reducing isolation and providing practical advice for recovery. These groups, whether in person or online, help normalize the experience of victimization while providing strategies for moving forward. Legal recourse for romance fraud victims remains limited due to the international nature of many operations and the difficulty of identifying and prosecuting perpetrators. Most romance fraud originates from countries with limited law enforcement cooperation agreements, making criminal prosecution unlikely. Civil recovery is similarly challenging when scammers operate anonymously from foreign jurisdictions. However, victims should still report these crimes to appropriate authorities, including local law enforcement, the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, and the Federal Trade Commission. These reports contribute to broader intelligence gathering efforts and may occasionally result in successful prosecutions or asset recovery. The role of technology in both enabling and preventing romance fraud continues to evolve as criminals adapt to new platforms and security measures. Artificial intelligence tools can help identify potential scammers through pattern recognition and behavioral analysis, while blockchain technology may eventually provide better identity verification systems. However, the same technological advancements that aid prevention also provide criminals with more sophisticated tools for deception. Deepfake technology, advanced translation software, and artificial intelligence chatbots may soon make romance fraud even more convincing and harder to detect. Education remains the most effective tool for preventing romance fraud, requiring coordinated efforts from government agencies, private companies, and community organizations. Public awareness campaigns must address the sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics used by scammers while avoiding victim-blaming approaches that discourage reporting. Financial institutions have begun implementing additional protections for customers who may be victims of romance fraud, including transaction monitoring systems that flag unusual patterns and staff training to recognize signs of financial exploitation. Some banks now require additional verification for large international transfers or provide cooling-off periods for certain types of transaction. The impact of romance fraud extends beyond individual victims to families, communities, and society. Family members often experience secondary trauma when loved ones are victimized, while communities lose trust in online platforms and digital communication. The aggregate economic impact includes not only direct losses, but reduced participation in legitimate online dating and social networking. Understanding romance fraud requires recognizing it as a serious crime that exploits fundamental human needs for connection and companionship. Effective prevention and response strategies must address both the technical aspects of these schemes and the psychological vulnerabilities they exploit. The future of romance fraud prevention will likely require a multifaceted approach combining improved technology, stronger legal frameworks, better education, and enhanced support services for victims. As criminals continue to adapt their tactics, society must develop equally sophisticated responses that protect vulnerable individuals while preserving the legitimate benefits of online communication and relationship formation. Success in combating romance fraud ultimately depends on creating environments where potential victims feel safe seeking advice, reporting suspicious activity, and accessing support services without shame or judgment. This cultural shift requires sustained effort from law enforcement, technology companies, mental health professionals, and communities working together to address a crime that thrives on isolation and secrecy. The complexity of romance fraud as both a financial crime and a form of psychological abuse necessitates nuanced responses that recognize victims as survivors of sophisticated criminal operations rather than simply individuals who made poor decisions. This understanding forms the foundation for effective prevention, intervention, and recovery strategies that can meaningfully address the growing threat of romance fraud in our increasingly connected world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.